This is the second part of the Geographic Information Systems in Water Resources lecture on spatial analysis, and this will focus on map algebra or raster calculations. Now, this is a pretty powerful concept in working with raster data. It allows you to perform cell-by-cell evaluation of mathematical functions. For example, you may have one raster that represents precipitation, another raster that represents losses due to, for example, evaporation or infiltration. And you can express an algebraic calculation, precipitation minus the losses, to get the runoff values. For example, 6 units of precipitation minus 3 units of loss results in 3 units of runoff. Now that can apply to really large grids, so you might end up doing calculations on thousands or millions of numerical values. So for example, cell-based discharge mapping by accumulation of generated runoff. You may have a radar precipitation grid, you may have soil and land use information. There may be a cell-by-cell based calculation from raster calculator operations that implement whatever runoff generation formulas you want. Then you end up with the grid runoff values. Then after that, you may combine that with topography to accumulate the runoff within watersheds. So the idea here is that no matter what the model is, and I know that hydrologists often like to research and debate the different kinds of models that are used for runoff calculation, in many cases they depend on spatially variable information, and this is where geographic information system is really useful. Now there's some subtleties involved in the calculations that I just want to talk a little bit about. There is resampling or reprojection of the inputs depending on the cell sizes. What happens if the one input grid is say 3 by 3 and the other input grid is 2 by 2, and perhaps you're interested in a region that has cell sizes that are smaller, that are 4 by 4? How will those calculations work? So I've set up a little bit of an example that we can experiment with that in ArcGIS. So this is the example. I've made up a precipitation grid that has 150 meter grid cells. I've made up an infiltration rate grid that is made up of 100 meter grid cells. And we might be calculating runoff as precipitation minus infiltration. So here is the precipitation grid, and there is the infiltration grid. And now we'll do some work with this in ArcGIS. So here I'm showing a folder where there are two files, precip.asc and infiltration.asc. These are text representations of those grids that I showed you. So for example, you can look at them with a text editor, and you can see that there's the number of rows and columns, the corner coordinates, the cell size, the no data value, and then the grid encoding. Remember, those were the basic elements of a raster that we showed you. And this is actually showing how you can take text information, encode it in a file, in this case, a text file that you can easily work with and represent, and then work with an ArcGIS. So this is a useful thing as well if you want to create information, gridded information in this case, and work with it in ArcGIS. Now I'm going to switch to ArcMap, and here I have a blank map that I've just opened, and I'm going to add some data to it. So let me add data and navigate to where I have this those files, and there is the precipitation ASCII file and an infiltration ASCII file. So let me just click on the precipitation one. So now this, you will see it should zoom to eventually when it gets loaded. I'm not quite sure what it's doing here. It should zoom to a location somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic where that data is present. So there it's been loaded. If I zoom to that layer, it's actually showing it's somewhere out in the middle of the ocean, and that's near the origin of coordinates, and that's because this data really doesn't have a geographic location, and we're just using ArcGIS as a convenient calculator rather than as a geospatially located information system. So I'm going to remove the topographic map from the display and just work with this data. Let me symbolize it with a different color scheme so that I can see a little bit better what's going on. And if I look at the individual values, I can see that there's a value of 4, 6, 3.1, and 4. Those were the numerical values that we had previously. I can add the other data set, the infiltration data set, and let's just pick a different color scheme for that as well. And you can see the numerical values that we provided for that, a value of 4, a value of 3.5. It's a little bit unfortunate this color scheme is showing both of those the same, but if I fiddle with colors, maybe that won't always be the case. I'll stop fiddling with colors because it's not really getting us anywhere. So now I'm going to do the raster calculation. So remember, we're doing precipitation minus infiltration to try and calculate runoff, and we're pondering a little bit perhaps what's going to happen because these grid cells don't align. And remember, I introduced map algebra raster calculations as cell by cell calculations. So the first thing I'm going to do is find the raster calculator in the tools, open the raster calculator, and you can see that it shows the various rasters involved. And I can say that we want to have precip minus, so this interface allows you to build expressions, and I was double clicking to get that minus, double click to get infiltration, and I'm going to name my result, and I'm just going to leave it. Well, I'm going to actually put it not in the geodata database, but outside, and I'm going to call it runoff.tiff. Now, this is one of the formats, one of the tricks that you can also do with ArcGIS. What extension you put on a file will dictate the format that you get. So in this case, I'm saving it as a geotiff file. And if I run this calculation, it'll do its work. And let's re-symbolize this so that we can see a bit better what's going on. And we see that we've got numerical values where there's a 1.8, there's a 2, there's a 1.6, and there's a 1.3. Probably it'd be better if I'm using unique values to represent the results. So you can see the unique values. But what the interesting thing that you've seen is that it did the calculation on the coarser grid size, in this case 150 meters, 150 units, not at the fine scale that infiltration was provided. So there's a question of where did these numbers in the runoff grid come from? If I look at a location somewhere here, somewhere we're near the middle, And if I click on Explore, and I should be able to control the grids that I'm showing by, if I say select to display not just the topmost layer, but all the layers, all the visible layers. Now if I click there, and if I expand this out here, you'll see the runoff is 1.8, but the precipitation for minus 2.5 should be 1.5. So it appears not to have done the raster calculation at this location, but if I go there, 4 minus 2.2 is 1.8. Here we've got the calculation 6 minus 4 is 2, but nearby there, 6 minus 2.5 should be 3.5, but the result is just 2. So what's actually happened is it's resampled the finer grid down to the coarser grid scale and used that. So I've got a slide that illustrates that. So this just shows the raster calculation tool and the results. The outputs were on a 150 grid. How were they obtained? There was a nearest neighbor resampling with the maximum of the inputs. So with the cell size, the maximum of the inputs. So whereas our infiltration grid was really on this 100-meter cell size, the calculator resampled the center value there of 2.2, applied it to this whole 150-meter grid, and for this 150-meter grid took the 4 minus this 4 from down there, minus that 2.2 to get that result of 1.8. Did the same over there, the same over there, and same over there. So that's what it's actually done. Now there's a question whether that's what you might actually want. Okay, I've got some animation that shows how these were actually worked out. ArcGIS has used nearest neighbors to align the grid cells. It's done the raster computation at the scale of the coarsest grid. Is that what you want? What if you actually wanted the calculations at a finer scale? And what is meant by scale in this context? So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the theory that underlies scale and how we think about scale in terms of data. And this applies generally not only to geographic information, but other time series information, and that's used in research calculations. This is work that comes from Günter Bloschel and is referred to as the scale triplet. Now, any data can be thought of as being described in terms of three things: the extent, the length of time or space that it covers, the spacing, the distance in between the values, and the support or the averaging value. And if you think of data and how it's interpreted, extent, spacing, and support, which are referred to as the scale triplet, make a difference in terms of how it's interpreted. So for example, in this top figure here, we've got a fairly high frequency regular sine curve. But if that's sampled, a spacing that's too large to capture that pattern, you get something else and you don't get the full representation of what's going on, and that would be referred to as aliasing. If you have a slowly varying function and maybe you have quite a small spacing, but your extent is all on the downhill part of it, then you might infer that there's a trend where there's really a cycle. And the third example is with respect to support. Maybe you've got your underlying function is the smooth curve again, but there's averaging over a footprint, the time it takes for whatever it is that you are measuring to quantify the information involved, or the size over which the surface is measured, and you average that, then I guess you also get a smoothing out. So that applies in our raster calculations in ArcGIS. So there's actually a way that you can control that. You can resample to get a consistent cell size. So this illustrates that as part of the calculations in ArcGIS, you can specify cell size. So now I'm going to switch back to ArcGIS, and let's go back into geoprocessing, and let's try and do that map algebra calculation again. So I'm going to, it's still sitting there, precipitation minus infiltration, but I'm going to give the result as runoff 100, because now I'm going to try and resample things down to 100-meter cell size. And there's an environments tab here that allows you to specify the various parameters. And if you look in that, you see here the output cell size was the maximum of the inputs. I could specify the output cell size to be the same as, for example, my infiltration layer, which should be 100. I might even snap it to the raster, the same as my infiltration. So, and there's other things, coordinate systems, geographic transformations that you can work with. So now, if I do the calculation, so now I've got a result where we have, if I look at the symbology of this, we have cell values. So let's turn that off. We have cell values where we've got the runoff is precipitation minus infiltration, and that's calculated based on this particular value. But in the middle cell, there's still a degree of ambiguity. I think I'm not finding the location where there's imprecision, because well, I guess there isn't ambiguity, but it has still actually done an interpolation involved. So let me switch back to the slides and show you what's actually going on here. So we were looking at this scale interpretation data. So you can set the output cell size. Okay, what I was showing there was actually something else. What I just showed you in ArcGIS was how to do that calculation within the by setting the environment variables of the program. What I actually had on the slide is I initially did a resampling. So rather than using the raster calculator, it's also possible to find a resample tool. And this is probably a more direct way to do the work, where you might pick your precipitation and you want to resample it down to have the output cell size the same as the infiltration. And now you can control what technique you want, whether you want to have the nearest neighbor resampling technique, or perhaps you want to have some sort of other interpolation, bilinear interpolation, or you can even go with cubic interpolation or majority interpolation, and you could read the help on that to control that. let's say, for example, we are interested in bilinear interpolation, and the result precip resample. So I'm just going to call it, I control where I locate that. I'm just going to call it precip 100 to tell me that it's at 100-meter scale, and do that calculation. So now I have the precipitation resampled, where the center value is now this 4.275 that was bilinearly interpolated from the other values. And then I could do the raster calculation as using that precipitation value minus infiltration. So that's where I'm actually controlling the spacing and the support, and I'm specifying the method. And then the calculation with a consistent 100-meter cell size precipitation minus infiltration, we get the values obtained. And here we have cell-by-cell calculation on the raster. So in doing this, we realized that there is actually interpolation involved. So I wanted to talk a little bit about interpolation, which is really estimating values between known values. Here we've been interpolating with regular grids, but interpolation isn't necessarily limited to that. It could apply for irregularly sampled points. And interpolation is really any set of functions that predicts a value for a surface from a limited number of sample points, creating a continuous raster. There's a number of approaches. Nearest neighbor is what seems to be the default in ArcGIS, and that would result in a sort of stair-stepped type surface. You might have an inverse distance weighting approach, or some sort of a bilinear approach that fits a surface, a linear surface in each direction, the x direction, the y direction, then multiplies them together. There's also Kriging, the best linear unbiased estimator that comes to us from geostatistics, or you can represent the surface as a spline that effectively uses polynomials to fit the surface and then samples the values. So here I'm going back again to Bloschel's work, in this case with Roger Grayson, and he's showing the implications of different forms of interpolation. So in these slides, the black dots represent the observed values, and then the line represents different forms of interpolation and how a smooth surface, or here he's represented in two dimensions because it's easier to visualize how that might be represented. And the top left is the Thiessen method, or what's effectively nearest neighbor, where you go to any point, you pick the nearest observation, and you assume there's that value, and you get the sort of stair-step approach. As you transition from being nearest to this point to nearest to that point, it goes down. The second one is inverse distance squared, and here right at the point you get the observation point. But here somewhere in between, you're weighting not only these points, but other points further away, and that's why this pulls down. And you might think that's a little bit counterintuitive. Then you can also fit various polynomials. So here you might have a polynomial that's too high a degree to really represent the surface, and you get something that's really quite wild. The top right is a smoothing spline, and when you fit splines, you get to control the parameters referred to as the tension that indicate how variable or how smooth the surface is. This is a result from Kriging, and this is another result from Kriging. So there's a number of options involved. We're not going to get into the real details of this, but I just wanted you to think about some of the issues involved as we're working with spatial surfaces and how they may have been constructed from irregularly sampled data, and the way the interpolation is done could actually matter in terms of how good the data is, how precise a representation it is of reality. So we've seen that there's generalization involved as we approximate information using a grid, as well as the interpolation method that influences what the data is. And all of this is really just the underlying interpretation of the data, notwithstanding trying to put physical interpretation on the sort of process relationships that are involved. This work by Grayson and Bloschel is actually in this book, Spatial Patterns in Catchment Hydrology, and the full text is available online at that website if you're interested in reading that. It's been made open by Cambridge Press because it went out of print, so it's freely available for you to download. So the summary concepts from this part of the lecture are that raster calculation involves algebraic-like operations on grids. There's a spatial reconciliation and some form of interpolation, and it's an inherent part of raster calculations. And we should pay attention to that as we interpret and work with data from raster calculations.